So I have 3D Studio Max 2012 here. I'll maximize that. If I make a box, it should translate 1 to 1. So the units, I'm making the box 512 by 512, 512 now. This 512 box should translate to 512, 512, 512 in Unreal. If it's not, you should change the units. The units I'm using are unit setup, generic units. Although technically you could use metric or US standard, you can technically use anything you want, because the moment you export it, it will be converted again. Therefore, you can change that conversion and use anything you want. But I would really advise you to use generic units, because otherwise it's going to get really difficult to work with, to my experience. So I have a 512, 512 box here. The next thing that's important, and again, I'll do this pretty quickly, because I assume that 90% of the people watching this video already know this. But just for the sake of being complete, and also some of you might have missed a couple of details. The pivot point in Unreal is world center in Max or Maya. So 000 in Max or Maya is the actual pivot point of the mesh in Unreal. It's not the pivot point that Max or Maya has, it's 000. So before we can export this, I will move it to 00, so it's right in the middle of the world. And then we can export this. So then I can do export selected, and it's quite a big window here, so it's out of view, but it's exporting as FBX. I can make it a bit smaller. So I'm exporting this as FBX, so I'll call it test cube or something. So FBX export. Then you get this kind of window, both in Max and Maya. And I pretty much left everything as is. The only thing that I enabled that's not on by default is in geometry, I enable smoothing groups and I enable triangulate. I'm not touching anything else. Everything else is just as it was. The only thing you might also want to pay attention to is it says here advanced options units. This is doing a conversion here. So you could turn off automatic and turn it to something else. Normally, to my experience, just keeping it on automatic should work totally 100% fine. But there are cases that I've seen that it does actually seem to do something weird with conversion, or in any case, I end up with a different scale in Unreal as I'm supposed to have. And then I found out inches or centimeters seem to somehow fix it again. Either way, normally automatically should work fine. Okay, and it exports. Then you can go to Unreal. You can go to the content browser. You can see I already imported a teapot here as test. At the bottom left of the content browser, it says import. Yeah, sorry for the very big windows. My resolution is way bigger than the capture area. In any case, I'm gonna select I selected the file, the test cube in the import dialog. Then I get this window. You can type a package name at the top. Either you type the name or you select it from the list. So these are all the existing packages. If you want a new package, you just type your new package name if you want. And a group is not required, you can do it, but it's not essential. And then you have the name of the mesh. As for import options, I'm using this. I have override full name enabled. These two off. You can technically import materials and textures along with the mesh, but I never do that because it gives me less control over what happens. It makes it harder to update content in the future, and also it's quite error prone, because if you were to look at Max, and the same thing happens in Maya by the way, if you have the material window in Max, and again exact same thing for Maya, it gives default names to things, so 0, 1, etc. defaults, you know, and if you make something in there, it will give you another weird name. So the problem is that it's going to take over those weird names unless you rename everything properly. See, now you have map space, I don't know, do you know what you call that in English, 1. And Unreal will take over that name, but it can't actually normally have this kind of character and a space in its name. So once it's imported, you can't modify the material anymore and it all turns into a mess. So I usually simply avoid that altogether and do it manually. It's not a skeletal mesh, so it's not even important, that section. And then in the static mesh part, I have replaced vertex colors enabled. That's quite handy if you work with vertex colors. And I have explicit normals enabled, and we'll get back to that later on. That's it. So you do OK, and you have a cube. If you double click the cube, as you probably know, you can look at it. You can see the size here, approximate size says 512, 512, 512. So it took over the units from max 1 to 1. And that's correct. Okay, that's almost basic export. The thing is that how I usually work with this in Max is rather than having one Max file per mesh that I do, and from this point on, I'm going to continue from my already existing scene, which is the one I made for this video. So these are all the meshes I'm using in this video. And this is how I usually work. I usually have one Max file that has just everything in there spread out over a large area, but it's one Max file with everything randomly laid out. And to my experience, this is the fastest and easiest way to work. It could look a bit disorganized, but it works really fast for me. So what happens here is I simply model whatever I need to model wherever I need it. For example, here's a rock. I will show you that later for the lotting example. High lot, medium lot, low lot. I simply place them all three next to each other, and when it gets exported, it automatically gets moved to 0, 0, 0, exported and moved back to the original position. And that's my workflow. So what I do is I name everything already in Max. Here's that window. So you can see every mesh here already has its name, rock, low lot 1, low lot 2. That has to be correct, that's step 1. Here you see the road 1, road 2, road 3, etc. That has to be correct, and I ensure that the pivot point is correct because it will use this pivot point to move to 0, 0, 0. So 0, 0, 0 in the world will be where the pivot point is on the mesh in Max. So I make sure that all pivot points are set where they should be set. So on the road, for example, the pivot point is in the middle here. On this one, however, it's on the end, etc. I make sure that the pivot point is where it should be. That's the point. And then I have a little script, and I've included this script with this tutorial. It's the Keen batch export script. There's also a second script that does pretty much exactly the same thing. I forgot the name of that, but I believe it's on ScriptSpot or the big Max script website. But either way, what these two scripts do is the moment it allows you first of all to batch export it, so you don't have to select every single mesh you have and then do export selected, which will take ages to do. It doesn't only do that, it also first moves it to 0, 0, 0. So the moment you have a mesh, if I export this through the script, it will first move it to 0, 0, which is there, then export it using the name typed in here, and then it will place it back on the original position where it was in the scene here, so it looks identical. And it exports as FBX. So this is what I do, and this is the fastest way to go. So when I start modeling something, I pretty much just draw it wherever I want. Do half the road first. Something like that. Then the size, though. The size is the one thing that is important. I immediately go for a size that's a power of 2. So I'll immediately go for a road that's 1024 long, for example. And say 256 wide, because I'm going to make half the road and then mirror it over. So 256 wide will eventually be a 512 wide road that's 1024 long, which is in line with the texture, because the texture is 2048 long, 1024 wide. So the road is half of that, 1024 by 512. So I immediately make sure that this is a power of 2 already. And then I simply model it. I will have 2 edges on the side to make it a little bit, to make it curve down a little bit like this. And the center is slightly higher than the sides, because I guess the road is a bit curved up so the water can roll off or whatever. And in general, I can quickly show you Unreal as well. What we're doing here is we're making a road that's on top of a landscape or on top of a big terrain. And it's pretty much just placed on top, as you can see. But we've done several things with the materials, and the material actually completely blends in with the ground. And also the shading blends in completely with the ground through vertex normals. So those are the two special things we've done here that allow the ground to be merged entirely. That's something I'll get back to later on. So yeah, this kind of does fine. Add a road texture to that. Here you have the road texture. I'll quickly copy this over to the other side, or rather rotate it. I'll merge the vertices because it's two different parts now. That's been merged. And I have a simple road. If I export this, provided the pivot point is in the right place, pivot point is not in the right place. But if I were to fix the pivot point, export this, it would already be modular. Because if the pivot point is in exact middle, then this edge will already be on the grid. So what the thing you're trying to do is making sure that everything is on the grid. Because Unreal uses a grid of 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, etc. So if you make sure that any number you use is on that grid, it will fit. So I'll move the pivot point to the middle of the mesh. And then down a bit. So now the pivot point is in exact middle. And it's placed on 0, 0, 0. And that should do. Maybe I'm going to place the pivot point slightly above 0, 0, like 1 unit above. And this should fit. If I export this, it should work. Let me try to move it to 0, 0. And let me hide everything that we don't want to see. And then what I do as verification here is if I select vertices at either end, so I select those over there, and I look at the coordinates, the position of the selected vertices, that's indeed on y512, and this is then on negative 512, and that's correct. So this will snap to the grid already. Then I'll quickly UV this, and I also do the light mapping, or perhaps the light mapping I can do later. I'll quickly UV the actual road itself. Well, that kind of works, it's just the planar map on top. And that pretty much does it. Okay, so now we have a road. I will name this, call it new road 1. I'll use a script to export it to a specific location. So I set the path, the folder to export to, and then I will type the type of export I want. So I will type FBX. All the other properties can be left as is, and you just press export. You get a normal FBX export when you just do OK on that. You can go to Unreal, and then you can import that. Just press OK. And we have a road. If I try to see if that's snapping to the grid, it probably is. I'm using a fairly big grid here. You can see here it says 64 now, just to make it a bit easier to work with. I drag it in. I can drag in a second one. I'm holding Alt. Alt dragging a mesh duplicates it. Same like Shift dragging something and Max duplicates it. And you can see this snaps to the grid perfectly fine because one part lines up exactly with the previous part. See, this is one part and here's a second part, and it lines up exactly. So we have a basic modular piece now. Then from there on, we're going to move on and make a couple of other pieces. So I'll quickly use my existing piece that I already have here to make myself a curve, for example. Duplicate it. I'll call it row 2. I'm actually going to move the pivot point to the end of the mesh on one side, because it's going to be a curve. It's much easier if the pivot point on a curve is on one of the two ends. And I'm going to add a couple of more divisions, just cutting it up across the width to make sure I can bend it. do this a couple of times, just dividing it up. It should probably also be longer, I just figured, because otherwise the curve is going to be too small. So I'm going to duplicate it, place one next to it, snap, attach that one to this one, merge the vertices. Okay, so I have a longer road, and there we go. Then I put a bend modifier on it. I always forget what direction it is. There we go, 90, 0 on Y. And we have a simple curve. Again, this still remains on grid. If I check for a moment and I move this to 0, 0, let me verify. And then what I always do is I look at the individual vertices. So we have a couple of vertices here. This is indeed on the grid. The height is not, but that's fine. But these two are 0, 0. And if you now take the other side, then this is actually not on the grid. And what I then tend to do to solve problems like these, because this should be on X, should be on the grid on X, and it's not, and also on Y actually. And in both cases it's 1,1303,797, obviously not a nice number, not a power of 2. Very clearly, if you take the calculator and you divide that by, for example, 16, it's not a nice number. It should have been 80 or something, then it would have worked. This doesn't work. So then what I have done, what I do in these kind of cases, is I made a little program, also included in this video, is someone once wrote this for me. It's called Rounder. And what it basically does is you input a number and it tells you the nearest correct number on a grid. So if I input this, which is what we have over here, negative, positive, doesn't matter. And then I say I want to match this to a grid of, let's say try 32 first. If I take 32, then it will tell me the nearest number that's on the grid, that's the correct number, is 13012. So if we take 13012 instead, or we can also try 16, and the nearest number on a 16 grid is 1296. So let's just take that. Okay, so 1296 works. Actually, this is not much off, and 32 is better, so I'll just use that. I copy that number, and I put that in the position over here. I put that in the position over there. And now it will snap to grid, because now I have a correct number on X and Y. And this is also how I sometimes work. So what I sometimes do is when I make boxes or something, I don't even have to immediately get them on the grid right away. I could simply select a face and say, okay, Y is minus 1241, etc. Okay, fine. Well, tell me the nearest number of that on a 32 grid. That's 1248. Copy paste that back in. There we go. The other direction is that. Wrong one. Nearest number is 3424. Copy that back in, etc. Now this face is on the grid. This is, again, one of the things that I found out is one of the easiest things to do. And as you can see, I'm not using any grid snapping whatsoever in Max. I never have a grid here. I never snap to the grid. You can do it if you want to, but I found out that this just goes so much faster. Instead of snapping to the grid, I just look up the position of each vertex and I just make sure that that actual position is snapped to the grid by itself. So there we go. Then I will just place it next to it somewhere and I can export both of those. Done. Go to Unreal. And we can import that. Import row 2. I already had row 1. And there we have row number 2. I'll drag it in as well. And you can see this part snaps already. It's on exact same. It nicely fits with the previous part. I'm gonna move it up, move it left a bit so I have a bit more space to work with. And then let's see if I can line up a straight part of the road on the end of the curve. And I remember it was a 32 grid and I'm on a 64 grid, so I'll step it down. And there we go, this also snaps perfectly fine with the previous part. It's a nice exact match, not the tiniest seam in between the two. It's exactly correct. And then I have this. So that's how I do basic modular modeling. And the basic exporting as well. One small thing I want to highlight in Unreal is in here. I mean, of course, with the road here, it's very difficult to see what you're looking at because the default camera angle for the thumbnail is from the side. So what you should do to begin with is rotate it in the angle that you want to preview it and then save the preview angle. At the top here, there is an eye that says save thumbnail angle. Press that. And now you can see the default angle is that instead. So it gets a bit easier to see what you're looking at. I'll save that for now. When you save it also, when you save any content package in Unreal, make sure you save it in the content folder of the UDK install that you're using. Don't save it on your desktop, don't save it in another folder, don't save it on network place. Save it only within the content folder of your UDK install. So UDK 2012-10 /UDK game /content, somewhere in there. Doesn't really matter what folder there, you can also make your own folder, but somewhere, anywhere in the content folder. Because if you don't do that, it will not find it. And also, when it comes to names, make sure the names do not contain spaces, no space whatsoever. Isn't too long, it should not be longer than 32 characters, I believe. It also can't contain any non-standard characters. So if you have like your localized keyboards, for example, Swedish characters, Turkish characters, whatever kind of characters you have, you can't use any of that. It has to be standard English, standard numbers or letters and nothing else. Underscores are allowed, but that's pretty much it. If you don't stick to all those rules, you're probably going to hit a major wall at some point. Also, it can't have names that are shared by other things. Unreal can't really see extensions to files. So Unreal can't see that something is called house.upk because house.upk for Unreal is exactly the same as house.udk. It can't see the difference in extension. The extension doesn't exist for it. It only looks at the file name itself. So your package can't have the same name as your level. It can't have the same name as a code package, etc. It should always be a unique name.